We acknowledge the Ancient Ones, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, Hermes, Thoth Trismegistus, and Seshet, Lady of the Measuring Cord, as above so below, as within so without. We acknowledge Imhotep, Architect of the Cosmos. May the earth be the mirror of heaven. We acknowledge the Sacred Order of the Magi, and all throughout history who knew, like now, a turning of the ages. We acknowledge the master builders of Gobekli Tepe and the great shining ones at Kalash, the courage and knowledge of the Polynesian wayfinders traversing the great oceans. We acknowledge the prophetic traditions of Ezekiel and Daniel, the traditions of Avalon, the Merlin, and the Round Table, the calendric wizardry of the Maya, and the Venus teachings from Mesoamerica, the Jupiter teachings originating in China, and the Vedic lunar mansion traditions, the Babylonian and Sumerian sidereal zodiacs, the brilliant Hellenistic invention of the seasonal zodiac. The Neolithic peoples around the planet, some still today, honoring the sacred connection between the land and the sky. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, who created a time of 2,000 years of peace, the builders of Newgrange. My teachers that are not in human form, Mount Shasta, the Grandfather Rock at the Wonderland of Rocks in Joshua Tree, Mount Haleakala on Maui, the Fish Lake Valley, Hierophany, and the sacred landscapes around the planet, the astrosophy of Rudolf Steiner, and the esoteric astrology of DK in the Tibetan, both presaging the shamanic astrology paradigm, and particularly the archetypal visions of C.G. Jung and the cosmology of my mentor, Dane Rijar. For these and more we give thanks.
Salutations from space, folks. This is Gemini Brett, the astronaut of More Than Astrology and celestial navigator of the Storytelling podcast, and it is my great pleasure to invite you along on this maiden voyage of a monthly interview series, The Further Adventures of Shamanic Astrology. I will be the host, the conductor of the interviews, but the star of the show, Mr. Daniel Giamario, the vision quester, the founder of the Shamanic Astrology paradigm, co-founder of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, along with Kaylin Castell. Daniel, how in the heavens are you?
Well, I'm about ready to embark on another adventure. I'll be getting on a plane tonight to go to England for our Stonehenge, Crop Circle, and Avebury trip. So we'll be talking about that one later. So I guess it's kind of a pretty good time to have our maiden voyage right before I go off on another adventure. I'm over here in Manila right now, and ready to go about 1/3 of the way around the world.
That's right, folks. Through the magic of the World Wide Web as we enter into this Aquarian age, I come to you from West Seattle, Washington on Thursday, July 30th, and Daniel a day ahead of us where it is Friday in the Philippines. I just want to say, Daniel, my first teacher of the Starry Fold, who's brought me into astrology and the magic of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, which really honors a living and breathing connection to the night sky, the marriage of heaven and earth. And Daniel and I share similar fascinations that really are a part of astrology, at least Shamanic astrology, which is to look into the ancient ones. Who were these stone circle builders? Who were the creators of these sacred sites that have been left to us that can seed our awakening in this lifetime, as Daniel has experienced for many years before me, and myself as well, traveling to places like Avebury, where Daniel's heading tomorrow, and Machu Picchu and Chichen Itza. And we're going to start these adventures, these further adventures into shamanic astrology with a very mysterious site, a site that really breaks the mold. Gobekli Tepe, at the Syrian border from Turkey in the southwest of that country. And so far, what has been excavated in this site are about 5 or 6 stone circles, but ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR suggest that there are at least another 20 of these gigantic stone circles. It's kind of like a Stonehenge plus, these amazing megalithic temples. This is Klaus Schmidt, who was the lead archaeologist that started uncovering this mystery of Gobekli Tepe. Klaus Schmidt recently passed away last year, but revealed to us this mystery, these amazing bas-relief sculptures into very hard stone that speak of astrological and astronomical mysteries. And so, Daniel, I'm going to go now into some images that you sent from your recent exploration of Gobekli Tepe. So what are we looking at here?
Well, I just wanted to preface this by saying that this show that we're going to be doing together is kind of weaving back and forth between these adventures to different sites, as well as some more advanced extrapolations on the astrological paradigm itself. And this first show is featuring this site, Gobekli Tepe, because I had an opportunity last May, the last week of May, to actually do a journey there with one of the world's leading experts on this site, and that is a man by the name of Andrew Collins. And so that we're going to be sharing here at first some of the pictures I took as part of this journey at the end of May. And that will then provide the foundation for our further speculations and investigations, which include some of the issues that have been of greatest interest to me, which is one reason why I wanted to do this show together with you, Brett, which are questions like, who are we as human beings, and what the hell happened? And is there something about our history that we weren't taught in our schools? And I would say absolutely yes. And I've been very much interested in questions like, was there original hierarchy? What was the relationship between men and women? Who were these builders? What are human beings anyway? Are we a crossbreed? Are we a hybrid species? Questions like that are going to be at the foundation of our investigations from month to month. And a pretty good one to start with is Gobekli Tepe, because this is the site that has completely overturned pretty much everything that mainstream archaeology and anthropology believed about who we are as human beings. And so that's the backdrop of our exploration right now, because this site is 12,000 years old. So let's quickly go through, well, maybe not hugely quickly, but let's go through the pictures I took just a few months ago. So what we're seeing here is what's happened is that in the last year they put an enclosure over the exposed limestone stones to protect it from the elements. Because the thing about these stones is that they had been underground. They were purposely covered over. Maybe they were exposed 500 years, 1,000 years, and then they were covered. And they are limestone, and the weather conditions will fairly quickly erode them. So they put a cover over it, and some of the pictures you're going to see later that Brett has assembled show the site before it was covered. So when we were here last May, it was we were seeing the remaining stones that have not been taken away to the museum, and where they all also are still doing excavation, but underneath this cover. They only do excavation for a few months every year. So they weren't excavating when we were there this time. So here we're seeing some of these stones, which you're going to be seeing later in some of the other pictures and slides, and just how big these stones are. Some of them are like 15 to 20 feet high. So these are some of the ones that are still undercover, that they're still in the midst of doing some excavation. And you can see down at the bottom on this one, there's an ubiquitous bird. We don't know exactly what it is, but it looks rather like a dodo bird down at the bottom of that particular column. What's interesting about these stones is they are set on they're not deeply in the ground like other megalithic sites. They're placed on top of what would you call it? On top of another stone, and it's almost as if they could be more easily moved that way. And this is what Andrew believes also, Andrew Collins, that they actually moved the monoliths as the cosmology changed, in order to have the alignments continually to be set on certain places in the sky. Here we see one of the holes, and the particular place this is in one of the enclosures is centered directly on where Cygnus would have been back at the time when the star Deneb and Cygnus the Swan constellation, at the time when this site was being used. This was one of the older ones, 12,000 years ago. And this is sort of the surrounding area, so you could get a sense of the area that Gobekli Tepe is located. Here we have places where excavation is taking place, where you can see the top of the T-shaped monoliths that are, as you can see one of them popping up out of the ground there. They're actually everywhere. So few of them have been excavated yet. Here we get more of a view of the surrounding area. It's the top of the highest hill in the area, actually. Here we have another example of the top of a T-shaped monolith that's popping up out of the ground there. Now this, you might wonder what that is. Well, it turns out that the area close to Gobekli Tepe is where they have found the origin. I mean, 28 different types of wheat and barley go back to its the first discovery of the earliest modified wild wheat and barley that was turned into grain. So this actually has been shown to be, this is proven to be actually a place where they made beer. This is, we could say, the oldest beer barrel in the world right here. And the speculation is that there's no sign that the people who built this site were anything like, the old movie pictures of slave labor. There were people who came, there were people who lived nearby that came and built the site. And quite frankly, they have to give them some kind of a reward for working so hard at building the site. And so we have the origin of beer from the place where the grain and barley was first created, actually, 12,000, 13,000 years ago. Now this gives you a sense of the size of the stones. This is not a stone. This is actually in the town of Urfa, or more recently called Urfa, which is the closest big city to Gobekli Tepe. They have a roundabout there, and the roundabout, they've actually have life size, authentic size of the stones. So it's actually, here's a good example. This actually did a pretty good job on it, even with the intricate carvings and the way they've embellished the stones. They should, there you can see there the fox imagery on that one, and those are the actual sizes of the bigger stones. What you're seeing here is that fairly nearby, I mean just a few miles out of Urfa, a few miles away from the site of Gobekli Tepe, is the remains of a place called Harran. Now this is pretty well known as being the original site of the Sabian society, the Sabians, that were a group that followed the ancient ways where astrology was actually their religion, their spiritual tradition. Nearby are remains of hills, of mounds, of the temples of Jupiter, Saturn, of the visible planets. Seven temple mounds that are associated with the different planets. Very little of it is left. We saw some of the stuff that had been taken from the site that are in the museum. But this is actually only about 20 miles from the Syrian border, actually. And here I'm standing above the site of Harran. And by the way, many astrologers have heard of the Sabian Cymbals. The Mark Edmund Jones and Dean Rajar's working with what they call the Sabian Cymbals. Well, where the word Sabian comes from is from this area. Stellar religion that lasted for a very long period of time. This is some of the monoliths, the blocks, the building blocks that are like scattered everywhere around there in the Harran area. Now, the next part of this are showing some of the things in the museum. By the way, when our group showed up there, it was only 3 days after they opened this museum. We were the first foreign visitors to this museum. And I've been to a lot of museums around the world, and to me, this is the finest archaeological museum in the world. This actually was not this particular statue here, which there are now lots of renditions of it that are being used by other people to illustrate this time period. This was actually found near Urfa, and people in Urfa believe they are the oldest city in the world. They all consider themselves to be descendants of Noah, actually. Here's some of the other stuff that's been taken from the first digs at Gobekli Tepe, and showing some of the intricacy of the artwork on the carvings that are on the artifacts there. Yes. Most people will assume that that's what's taking place. The woman is giving birth there. Incidentally, one thing I'll mention, this has been compared to Stonehenge, but there's something rather remarkably different. Stonehenge is very plain stones. There is really not an intricacy of carving and artwork on the stones. And this is maybe 6,000-7,000 years older than Stonehenge, and you're going to be seeing later on the stones themselves, on the monoliths, how much actual art and embellishment there is on the stones. Here's some of the other things that were found at Gobekli Tepe, different animals, different beings. Not always can we tell what they are. This is my attempt to take some photographs in the museum. Yeah, just more. Who are they? What are they? We in our group spent a lot of time trying to say, what do you think that is? What kind of animal is that? And this one, is it a bird of some kind? And what? If so, what is it? Andrew Collins actually has a whole thing he's done on this, trying to figure out what this is, and had people trying to give their guesses as to what it is.
We see a lot of birds and kind of boar-like animals, and these foxes showing up again and again.
Yes.
And this kind of imagery of fertility, or one could assume. Now this, to me, Daniel, is the most mysterious imagery here. And later on in the slides that I brought forth, we'll really take a look at this kind of seemingly totem.
Yeah, because you have one of where it was still existing at the dig before it was actually taken to the museum. And this is actually a rendition of that hole, which Andrew believes, and I think he's right, it was an orientation toward where the North Star was in the time frame when Gobekli Tepe was being used.
Now, is this a replica of this stone in the museum?
Yes.
Okay, I see.
Yes. In fact, they have a whole a life size, authentic size mock-up of several of the enclosures at the museum. So this is from the museum, and I think I've included some of the other shots of that with the pictures that I sent to you.
I see. Yeah, and we see these holes in some of these megalithic sites, these ancient sites in Egypt, here in Gobekli Tepe, and Peru and Bolivia, these almost seemingly impossible, perfect cores out of very hard stone. And so some more of this imagery here, these H's that show up a lot, and we'll get back into that later.
Yes.
Here's that fox, right?
Yeah, and Andrew actually. Oh, here we have the. This is in the museum, and you can see the person down there to the left, so you can get a sense of the scope and the scale of it. This is one of the main enclosures that a whole mock-up of it has been done in the museum. This is completely accurate to the actual size of the enclosure that these monoliths are in.
Maybe.
And by the way, there's always two in the middle. And then most of them have 12 on the outside. So there's like 12 stones on the outside, 12 monoliths, and then 2 on the inside.
And the back of the skull and a snake, maybe Kundalini here, this imagery we see in Egypt again in places around the world.
There are guys that from India that saw this and said, this is proof that the priests at Gobekli Tepe were actually Vedic priests. It's definitely proof that our culture goes back 12,000 years, because this is exactly what we have in India.
Or did you learn it from them? The other possibility.
Now this was to me one of the more remarkable ones. What is that? I mean. What is the? Andrew thought it was actually a bird mask, but I don't know. I think that it represents something else. Here's this being, and that looks like a woman that is underneath him there, or whatever that is. I've taken a couple of shots of this from different angles. Certainly reminded me of the different examples, artist renditions that I've seen of the Anunnaki.
Indeed, and I mean, not to take it too sci-fi, but that form doesn't seem too far from the Aliens and the Aliens movies, but it's, very clearly a being that is human and a being that is not human embracing. So more mock-ups, of different sites here.
Yes. So this is actually a square one. This is about 1,000 years later. They found other sites nearby that with a similar kind of T-shaped monoliths, but they shifted it to a square shaped a little bit later on. So the square and round ones that have the same T-shaped monoliths.
And in our exploration of the masculine and feminine over time, of course, the square and the circle will come into that as we move through these journeys, these explorations. And I mean, this one is just breathtaking to me because this is clearly Sumerian, yes?
Yeah, this is not from the time period of Gobekli Tepe, but this was taken from the ruins, the remains of the temple at Harran. So these are the symbols of the Sabians. And you can obviously see the connection to astrology. In fact, they have in the museum the cuneiform remains of the astrology tablets that are from Harran.
Indeed, I mean the seven-pointed star here. Speaking of the 7 traditional planets and the 7 days of the week, the moon, the sun glyph, and this cat here who's holding some kind of agricultural implement possibly, or a world tree, who's very similar to the Anunnaki of the Sumerian stories, which will definitely be part of our study and quest moving forward.
Right there, that's just from looking at it from a further back. That same imagery of the star priest and from Harran, the Sabian priest,
and allowing us to see the cuneiform scripture on this tablet or writing on this tablet as well.
Right. So this is definitely from a later period, but the reason I was really fascinated by going to that site is that it's just within a few miles. It's all happening there. I mean, that's the center point in so many different traditions, including Urfa being a place that claims to be the birthplace of Abraham, also, as well as they all claim descendancy for their ancestors being Noah. Now, this next part. The next day, we went to a different site that has not been fully excavated, only partially excavated, and we went to this hilltop, and all over we can find these sticking out of the ground, more of these T-shaped. I mean, this whole hill, Harran Tepe, is just. It's just a whole other huge site nearby, and here we are. This is Andrew and the rest of our small group going across this hill and noticing here's yet another one, pretty much from the same time period of another buried site. There's Andrew.
My understanding is that Klaus Schmidt basically started digging at Gobekli Tepe. It wasn't the first local site where he was excavating, but before that it was going to be mowed down so rocks of this hill could be used for roads in the place.
It was going to be a quarry, a rock quarry. That's right. And he's alleged to have looked at it and said, "Oh, here we go. There's just a partially excavated area where there's the T-shaped one. You know that further down there's a whole enclosure underneath there."
So when you're walking around and stubbing your toes, folks, there might be a little bit more under the ground than we would think. Everything goes sideways here.
Yeah, and you can see from that how different it is when it's been exposed to the air for a while, and then the area that has been covered by earth. Because further down you go, you're going to see all kinds of inscriptions and carvings on the limestone. There's an example of how quickly it gets weathered.
I mean, and we could see this.
It's not covered up.
We could see this walking around and think nothing of it. Just another stone on the earth. But this guy doesn't think so.
And there's the quarry. That's where they're actually taking stones out of the ground and shaping them for the T-shaped monoliths. It's been noted around the world. I mean, whether it's in Java or whether it's in Giza, in Egypt, whether it's in the step pyramids of the Maya in Central America, that anytime you have these sites, there's usually a cave nearby. And Andrew said, "Where are the caves? We got to find the caves." And so we did. There's on the hill next door, facing north from Harran Tepe, looking north. Then there's a hill that had all the caves, and we found them and we explored these caves, including, here's an example of where the entranceway was definitely carved into the limestone in order to find an entrance into the ground. There's another one of the cave entrances on the nearby hill.
And back to Gobekli Tepe here and the archaeological dig, and so many archaeologists won't really look at Gobekli because it just shatters the mold. I mean, we are told in the current understanding of anthropology and archaeology that these sites are so old that they would have had to have been built by hunter-gatherers and people who did not yet have the social norms to come together in these group projects. But just look at this. I mean, look at this amazing bas-relief, right? I mean, this kind of reptilian-looking animal here on this stone is carved from the negative space of the stone itself, right? And
right.
I mean, it's just fascinating technology. And here's that totem again.
We have to remember, you just take this in. 12,000 years. This has been radiocarbon dated. I mean, 12,000 years old, and up until recently, and boy, it's so true. It's like American archaeologists don't even want to touch this stuff. I mean, I talked to the Turkish archaeologists, and they're saying, "Wow, what more do we have to do to show the world about this place?" Even the Egyptologists don't want to touch it because they have this huge stake about Egypt being the first somehow. How could simple hunter-gatherers do this? You need to have an advanced agricultural-based culture with lots of people in order to have these temples. not true. We
Right.
now know it's the other way around.
And, or even instead of rejecting this as not existing, because clearly it does, maybe they can relax their ideas about the ages of the stones that cannot be radiocarbon dated, the pyramids, the Sphinx, taking us back to Robert Schoch's work and the geological wear on the Sphinx, showing that it's much older than archaeology and the accepted models would currently tell us. But so here we have this very interesting totem from a few angles. And I assume this at the museum you visited, Daniel?
Yes,
Right.
yes.
And so we can see these snakes on the side here. We get some other images of it, and clearly the top face has faded away over time. But these hands kind of in the navel, the belly position that we see so often throughout the Gobekli Tepe and local area imagery. And here we have this like human child, in a sense, being born from this totem that carries, I mean, to my eye, some kind of bird-like features, reptilian-like features, these hybrid features, clearly serpent imagery, and the birth of a child who's, I don't know, maybe he's got one of those beer bushels in his hands. Maybe they were starting early back then. But, I mean, this great mystery of this totem itself, I mean, we could spend 6 hours there, so we'd better move forward. This is not an image from the site, but an image that I added to these slides just to show the Anunnaki, these gods, you know, in Zechariah Sitchin's translations of the Sumerian tablets, the cylinder seals, who many people base their Sumerian ideas around, but more academic studies as well. Without a doubt, these tablets speak of another race of beings, the Anunnaki.
One of the subcontexts of our further adventures of shamanic astrology explorations here will be to look at the subject of, well, who are we? And there's different opinion. I mean, difference of opinion. Some of the researchers, the Michael Tellinger camp, coming from the Zechariah Sitchin camp, have us as being hybrids with beings from other planets. You know, whether it's the Nephilim from Planet X or Nibiru, from Sirius, from the Pleiades, starseed from elsewhere. But then people like Andrew Collins, and he is in the tradition of a man that I used to study the work of. He died some years ago, a man named Stan Gooch, an English researcher, who was the first one who was trying to promote the idea that humans, as we know them today, are a crossbreed between with Neanderthal. You know, so basically, there's a hybrid being that came from somewhere in Central Asia, in the Russia area, to create a crossbreed, and so the people who built 12,000 years ago, and the architects, we could say, of Gobekli Tepe are a crossbreed that come down from that area of the world. If you want to have a greater sense of that thesis, Andrew's book on Gobekli Tepe that just came out goes into that in great detail. Stan Gooch, who was laughed at from the anthropological community for so many decades. Now we know it's true that humans have as much as 5 to 7% Neanderthal DNA, or Denisovan if you're more Asian. So it's a subcontext to our investigation here.
Indeed. I mean, and we see some imagery of hybridization. And so, you know, in these days, taking the kind of Eric von Daniken and Zechariah Sitchin information and bringing it to History Channel's Ancient Aliens, and so many people are very quick to say that this must be some advanced extraterrestrial species, maybe spoken of by Native American traditions of the star, you know, people, the star beings, the brothers of the sky. In the Bible, the sons of God coming down here to breed with the daughters of man and these things. But as we look through these ancient sites, we will see again and again that time, as we've been taught, is not necessarily linear in the unfoldment of human consciousness, but rather cyclical. And it would seem that at times on Earth, great cataclysms, some shifts have maybe, taken us down to very few people. The Noah story that lives in so many places, and then the rebuild, and the sinking of Atlantis, if you will, if that's not too far out. And with this story of the Anunnaki, people who are listening to this interview have probably come this far in studying the Anunnaki in some respects, and many ideas that they come from space, whatever. But the idea is that they are in some way contributors to the human genome, to perhaps a hybridization process that catalyzed our evolution. Who's to say? And there's a lot of story out here would say that these are evil people having created the slave race and conducting those crazy experiments still, and that's not necessarily true.
That's the other subcontext of our investigation here, and one thing that's fascinated me, and it goes into the pretty much every talk I've ever given in the world, around the world, is that originally there was Gialini, there was cooperation, collaboration. The humans were more egalitarian. Hierarchy had not been invented yet. There wasn't the different classes. There wasn't the castes. There weren't these ideas of domination of one group over another. We as a human species for 150,000, 200,000 years was more collaborative. And then something happened, maybe as a result of the cataclysms that we know for sure happened 12 to 13,000 years ago. That there was an elite group. Maybe they were hybrids that were from space, some maybe not. I mean, we don't know exactly where they were from. But then there was this group of folks that wanted to help humanity come back to flourish again. And it took a long time for that to happen. And so sometimes hierarchy could be thought of as these individuals who were teaching us how to bring certain technologies back in. Or who knows? Maybe they were the ones also that just wanted to have control, and so we have the results of the higher caste and the class system that are dominating other layers and levels of humans. This is one of the things that I'm really into exploring. But the bottom line to me, regardless of what we discover about Gobekli Tepe or in our next show about Gunung Padang, no matter what we discover about that, 150,000 to 200,000 years of human history of us having the same DNA was way more about collaboration, egalitarian, and this harmony between the peoples of the Neolithic times, a balance between masculine and feminine. And so when we're looking at this stuff around 12,000 years ago following the cataclysm, we're trying to get clues. What happened? What happened to human beings? Why is there the dominator thing? Why did patriarchy take over? Things like that. Why did the great mother religion? And right here at Gobekli Tepe, Anatolia is like the center, one of the center parts of the entire planet for the great mother religion. For the Earth Mother as the core tradition on this planet. The goddess Cybele is everywhere around that whole area. So anyway,
and indeed, let's
things.
Be careful, folks, in our exploration, not to believe everything that is shown to us or that we read, not to take theories on as fact. This idea of a slave race to mine gold, let us honor that possibility, but seeking is not believing sometimes, and relaxing what we think we know so that we can learn is such an important part of this quest and this exploration of great mystery. And, there's stories, if we honor the myths as more than fallacies, as I certainly do, and Daniel certainly does, we hear these similar tales from all over the world. And one of these tales is a tale of the great civilizers who came, from the Egyptians, from the Dogon, from the people here in America, all around the world, being taken to places where they were shown how to make this transition from a hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies, and taught how to build and taught all of these skills of civilization. So this does not have to be some evil empire of alien hybridization. And yet we do have strange images from nearby Navali Kori of this kind of serpent thing and strange gray aliens dancing, perhaps.
Right.
So let us honor it all and explore it all.
Well, because we're curious to find out what really happened. I'm truly curious. I really want to know. I think it's really important for human beings to understand who we are and where we've come from, and to know that what we're taught in regular history in the most of it is just it's like one tenth of the story, with most of the rest of it is being like being afraid to look at it.
Indeed. And going to these places, I have not yet been to Gobekli Tepe as Daniel recently has, but there's something where we cannot explore these sites until we are there. It's certainly worthy of our investigations intellectually, watching the videos, hearing the podcasts, but if you can go to these sites, there's an energy, there's a memory stored in the stone, I would suggest. And so we see these things about, here's pictures of the Neolithic process in the Middle East that is pushing the date of the site, yeah, it's just interesting how these archaeological models are very much being challenged by these sites. And instead of allowing ourselves to relax our beliefs, to reform our models, there's such resistance to that, even though this proof is right in front of our eyes. I mean, who built this site, Gobekli Tepe, that's been around for so long, and we've only uncovered a small percentage of it.
Very small.
And it would seem over time, I believe, Daniel, this is right, that it seems that some of the older circles were in a sense decommissioned, buried, and then new circles built on top of them, or as you mentioned before, these circles being adjusted to keep up with the changing sky through the astronomical effect of precession of the equinoxes.
It seems to be part of a worldwide tradition. We can see it in Egypt and other places, that there was a shift, almost like a stylistic shift, from something that was entirely stellar, and then also using the moon, and then later it shifted into a more emphasis with the sun. And clearly, the further back you go, it's more with the star patterns. It's more, and so the part of the subcontext of our investigation is also regarding the turning of the ages. And I have to give credit to Andrew Collins for being the one who first brought up the possibility that it goes back to pre-Vega. I mean, in the Shamanic Astrology teachings, I always take it back to 13,000 years ago, to when Vega was the North Star. But Andrew Collins was pointing out that 14, 15, 16, 17,000 years ago, that the constellation we call Cygnus, which is the only constellation that has really strong, bright stars that are right along the Milky Way, that where you would actually have at a certain point a North Star that's right exactly along the galactic plane. And he believes that a lot of these sites are aligned with that, and I think it's true. I think he's really onto something, that Gobekli Tepe is orienting itself toward the time when these great birds, whether it's a vulture, whether it's the eagle of the north, whether it's a swan, so many. His book goes into this in great detail. I'm not going to go through all the examples of it here right now, but there's a bird that could be thought of as at the top of the world tree. And then you have north as exactly that bird, and the North Star being Deneb at a certain point, and then these sites are oriented toward it.
And we'll see some images of these bird slides moving forward. And in further adventures into these explorations of shamanic astrology, we will also look into some astrological questions. What is constellational astrology? What is sidereal astrology? What is seasonal astrology? Which is the study of heaven? Which is the study of the correspondences of earth? How are we meant to honor them all in this marriage of heaven and earth, and bring these old traditions back into agreement so we can know more? But back to earth now, and back to Gobekli Tepe.
And by the way, I mean, if we're talking about this thing being 12,000 years old, which we know to be true, well, the circle had 12. All right, there are 12 monoliths that are in almost every one of the circles. So just keep that in mind. Where does this 12 come from? I mean, and plus these stones have different animals that are on our currently understood zodiac, but seems to go back to an earlier understanding of the zodiac.
Indeed. I mean, the 12 tribes, the 12 disciples, the 12 months, the 12 signs, and the 12 constellations of the zodiac. So back to Gobekli Tepe now, we see some imagery here in Turkey that really expresses itself in other mysterious sites around the world. Dan, I want to ask your opinion of this. So one thing that's a very prominent feature on many of the images in Gobekli Tepe is the fox image that seems to be worn as a loincloth here, perhaps. We see these H's. But first, this exploration of these hands at the navel that we see on these Gobekli Tepe stones. And here's another image. This is, of course, Easter Island and the Morai. And so many think that these statues are just the chest and the head, but you can dig down, and we have a long time ago, and nobody's really talking about it. There's actually been another recent explosion of this truth, but look at the hand position on this fella all the way across the world in the middle of the Pacific off the coast of Chile, Easter Island, and the same hand. So what is this? Does this say that these people were taught by the same people, that they came from the same culture? What do you see in this, Daniel?
Actually, Andrew has the same slide presentation of connecting this with the other similar ones, and whether it's Easter Island, but also Tiwanaku, other parts of the world. I don't know. It seems to have something to do with a particular pose that you take when you're trying to connect with Earth energy. I mean, it's an area around the navel. There are some archaeologists that say, "Oh no, they're basically holding their phallus," but most of them do show it somewhere around the navel area, which in most tantric traditions, most yogic traditions. And that's it's really not up the third eye that they're getting energy. It's down in the what do you call it, there's different words. It's whether it's in between the second and third chakra, the area around the navel, the area of life force, the where you connect with life force.
Sure, the hara and the cauldron.
Yes, right. That's what I was thinking about. So it seems to have something to do with that. I mean, it's a way of connecting heaven and earth right through that center point, that area in our gut, which actually we now know has more neurological and there's more brain, in a sense, brain cells there than there is in the brain. Right there in the gut, it's got its own center of intelligence.
Right, and so let's allow these windows of contemplation that we are opening be traveled into further down the road. But what we see here, without a doubt, is that this hand position of Gobekli Tepe in Turkey is very similar to this one here in Easter Island. And here's another image. I mean, this strange character, not from Gobekli Tepe, but from sites nearby. I believe you said this was Ursa. Is that correct, Daniel?
Urfa, from the town of Urfa.
Urfa,
the oldest. They consider the oldest city in the world. It was the very first settlement after. This is their view of it. From when the flood water has subsided, and they built Urfa, and then Gobekli Tepe is only about 15 kilometers from there.
Right, and we see here that same hand position, not holding a phallus, unless it was rather strange back then, but holding something. And this V-neck, kind of Star Trekian feeling, you know what I mean? And a lot of people call their attention to the fingers here, and some of the fingers of statues around the world, which seem to have an extra finger. And the big book would talk about the Nephilim and these six-fingered ones, and the shining ones that we hear about from so many different traditions. So.
Well, and I actually thought that was the case here, that they were showing the five fingers, and then where's the thumb? But it was pointed out to me that actually it's that the way they've done that is to show the fingers and the thumb together.
Indeed, so, right.
The other factor which didn't come clear yet in our discussion is that, and this was the thing that kind of blew my mind the most when I went there in person. I didn't realize at first that those monoliths, the T-shaped monoliths, were actually intended to represent beings. It's because there's the hands, the clothes, the embellishments on the stones that they're actually intended to be stylized examples of these elite beings that we're teaching them.
Indeed, and it's not just the hands. So we'll see some slides coming forward where we get to see the arms on the side and other human form figures. But so back to the Morai again, these strange long fingers, and here are kind of some recent images from digs on Easter Island where we see these incredible carvings on the back of the Morai. I mean, this guy seemingly vomiting from the top of the head. But what's really interesting here in these perspectives of the correlations between Easter Island and Gobekli is these kind of bird-like figures, these almost like ibis bird figures, these swan, these vulture birds.
Now this one is just without question. I mean, this one is so stunning in the imagery, even a connection with the sky, where we have the vulture, we have the scorpion, and actually when you look, if you see the Milky Way coming down perpendicular as it would have been 13, 14, 15,000 years ago, the rendition of the constellational groups all the way up to Cygnus, it really matches quite well.
Right, and if you know the sky, the Milky Way moves through the Summer Triangle, specifically through Cygnus, through this entire constellation of the Swan, later called the Northern Cross, and now it's a swan again, and then down to that tail of the Scorpion that's pointing to galactic center. So again, here kind of clear images of the Morai from Easter Island with these kind of ibis bird shapes on the back, or maybe these are rams. I mean, hard to decipher, very mysterious. Back to this strange cat, and this I know, Daniel, you don't necessarily agree with, but I see like some imagery that feels similar between this character and the Kachinas of the Hopis here in our land.
Well, my only comment on that was the fact that the Kachina religion of the Hopis is really recent. I mean, that was the thing they came up with as an antidote against what happened at Chaco and what happened during the destruction of the culture at that time period. So they came up with they kind of went back to a more egalitarian, non-hierarchical version of societal structure. So my only comment on that was that it's the Kachina religion. Well, if we're talking about how old these traditions are, we're talking about stuff 8, 9, 10, back to 12,000 years ago. Well, the Kachina religion is just in the last really 500, 600 years.
Indeed, and I mean, archaeologists would say that people weren't even on this land, hadn't walked across the land bridge by then, but the Hopi tell a different story, and we'll get back to that a bit. But,
yes. Actually, I want to mention about that in our next show, which will have to do with Java and Sundaland, and then we'll say what some Hopis actually do say about where they come from.
Yeah, and then maybe we can bring it home to America for future episodes. So, I mean, here's another just amazing image, not one of the T-shaped pillars, but this kind of arm angle that we'll see later, and just these, very interesting images, these sculptures. This guy really reminded me of this site that you had mentioned earlier, Daniel. This is in Bolivia. Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, very close by. This is an image of Viracocha, who is said to be the creator of humankind, that he created us and then put us underground, and that he with his two sons later walked north, calling us forth when we were ready. But again, not necessarily in the same place of the body and holding different implements, but these hands, again, coming together from the side. And this is also in that area of Bolivia, well above Lake Titicaca, these H's, which we also see in Egypt in places, we see in Peru, and we see in Gobekli Tepe again and again.
Well, the original researchers that went down to Tiwanaku, and they looked at it from a processional perspective, from a stellar perspective, and basically came up with a similar age for when that was built, 12 to 13,000 years ago.
And I mean, how are these things happening simultaneously around the world? Where did these people come from? Clearly they were not just some hunter-gatherers whittling. Here we see that H on one of the stones, the arms, the hands, that image from Urfa we've been looking at a bit. And on the right, these bull figures, the kind of ibis bird or dodo bird, the fox, these kind of very correlated to astronomical, constellational images here. But this H I'm very interested in. There has been some suggestions that this was perhaps an ancient view of Orion. Now, I personally find that to be a bit of a stretch. Orion's belt is in no means perpendicular, and that's what we see. I mean, why wouldn't they draw that diagonally? Clearly, these people could make incredible sculptures. And Daniel, we see here actually a really good example of something that you told me about, which is that H on the stone that we're looking at with the arrow pointed to. It kind of looks like two beings holding hands, and you directed me to this film, which I really suggest people check out. It's incredible. And what's the theory they put forth about the center stones in this film?
Well, yeah, there's always two stones in the middle, and so the speculation is that it would represent like a man and a woman, or sort of the two dominant leaders of the hierarchy, or the teachers, or however you want to look at it, and basically it's them shaking hands. It's like reaching out and connecting, and in this particular movie, they actually do a fabulous job of simulating it, where you have the two big beings in the middle with the elongated skulls, and they kind of turn, and their hands touch and join. It's certainly worth speculating about, but otherwise, who knows what the old hieroglyph script actually means? And we're trying to get clues just by looking at it and sensing into it, and said, wow, this is not. The further back you go, it gets even more interesting. It's not like the myth of linear progress. There's a good example of the way myth. The way most people today think of myth, meaning not true.
Right. So maybe we should say that as a fallacy. I mean, and look at this clear image here of these birds. Here we see that H in front of the bird's beak, like tilted on its side, more of a vertical formation. Is this maybe how the stones are formed underground? But it takes us back to this interest of the birds, the interest of Cygnus, and into this work of Andrew Collins, and Daniel mentioned before, we don't want to repeat everything that Andrew Collins had to say here, but just to bring some of that forward and into
the book is fabulous,
and
actually, I also want to give props to people like Robert Schock, who also has gone to Gobekli Tepe a number of times, has done work with it, and of course Graham Hancock, and others that are these alternate history researchers who are not just making stuff up in their heads. They actually go to these places and tune in and learn as much as they can about them. But Andrew probably has gone to this site the most, and whether I don't necessarily agree with everything he comes forth with, but it gets you started in investigating what may be happening here. And this picture here shows that sight line straight to the galactic plane, and it would show how that would be right in between the two of the monoliths, and right when Deneb was the North Star, maybe 16,000 years ago.
Right, and this is important to know, folks, and something that Daniel will lead us through coming in future episodes, but this mystery of precession of the equinoxes, this 26,000 year great year. I mean, north is always north, but the North Star is not always Polaris as it is now. So we've been mentioning that the Milky Way certainly would not always make this alignment. And so in the study of archaeoastronomy, we can actually rewind the clock and use what we know about this strange phenomenon called precession of the equinoxes to see some alignments like this one pictured here on Mr. Collins' book. And you can find a lot of interviews with Andrew Collins about Gobekli Tepe, about Egypt. I really recommend you check out the movie he made about finding some caves under Egypt recently, and some of the flack he's taken from that. So we'll let you do that. But here's just some images of Cygnus, this constellation that we've talked about a few times during the course of this interview, in the sky, how it seems to hold this shape of this bird that shows up a lot. We see that scorpion aligned to the scorpion down below. And Andrew Collins, in his work, has shown a lot of really cool images of those correlations, especially of this stone. So now this fella here, I mean, we've got these weird arm things happening with the hands, and now it's pointed, if we look at the belly, into, again, like, you know, kangaroo pouch style, or birth, or the hybridization, or who knows. But what fascinates me so much about this one is that kind of hammerhead imagery of elongated skulls that we see in Egypt. This is Nefertiti, I believe, right? Akhenaten. Right. And the Paracas skulls of Peru. So just to present that, to let you know, we'll be journeying into some of those mysteries together in the future. But for now, this fox that we see more than once, in fact, all over the place in these images of Gobekli Tepe. And the fox, or coyote, this trickster being from so many of the different shamanic traditions around the world, often having been referred to this. So Daniel, please bring the idea of the comet.
Well, this is
in for
also
us.
Something that Andrew talked about in his book, that the fox tail, the particular way in which the tail of a fox is, was something that certain cultures would use to represent a comet. So that, I mean, not everybody would necessarily agree with this, but this relates to the question about, all right, we know for sure now that something rather major happened at the end of what is called the Lower Dryas, which is when a very rapid melting of ice happened and the oceans raised a couple hundred meters really quickly. And so one of the speculations would be, so what caused this? What was the trigger? Was it a comet impact? Some Andrew and Graham, I think, believe the comet approach. Others might say volcanic eruptions. Robert Schoch believes it was had to do with solar bursts, major, what is it called, mass coronal ejections from the sun. So it might be a combination of all three. But Andrew really thinks that it has a great deal to do with the cometary impact, and so a lot of the stuff on the stones would refer to the events, you know, and actually there's a whole body of work on this, that after the cataclysms that happened, they tried to figure out a way to warn humans if it was going to happen again. There's that body of the body of material having to do with the Keys of Enoch, that would have to do with the fact that in the book Enoch, the apocryphal work, it's a description about how you can determine when comets are coming in again. That Uriel's Machine is the name of that book. But anyway, there's some view here that this, whenever this fox shows up, that it has to do with the cometary impacts and the kind of medicine teachings that comes from that. I have. It's just part of the speculative journey we're on here. To what in the world is it that happened?
And indeed, and whatever it was, something happened. I mean, we have seen this from so many different scientific approaches, that there was a great shift long ago, the Younger Dryas climate period coming around, not long from this time that Gobekli Tepe has been dated to. And, you know, one thing that is most fascinating about this site, I mean, not only the incredible sculptures, the astronomical alignments, the many different, just everything, right? But one thing that is so fascinating is that it was intentionally buried. And
yes.
Some have claimed that that would actually require more work than building the site in the first place. I feel like that might be a stretch, but one thing that interests me greatly is that there have been found in the soil that Gobekli Tepe was buried in traces of nanodiamonds. Now, nanodiamonds we have only produced artificially through nuclear explosions, and the theory is that this is something that could be caused from a cometary impact, asteroid impact, something like this. And, you know, the feeling I get is that perhaps the Gobekli Tepeans saw this thing coming and decided to bury this very sacred site perhaps for us to find later as we are now. We are finding so many of these wonderful, mysterious sites, these gifts left for us by the ancients, so we can know more about who we are now. And so another thing that really interests me about this is not too far away from this site, we see places in Turkey like Darien Kuyu, like Cappadocia, these underground cities, these anthills, some of them being able to hold 20,000 people, these doors in them that could only be closed from the inside. What were people going underground to hide from? This is how far Cappadocia, Darien Kuyu are from Gobekli Tepe, not right there. But what is it that people chose to live underground? Did they have to? And was perhaps the knowledge that a comet was coming and this decision to bury the sacred sites and to move underground to weather the storm? I mean, these are not simple places or even architecturally possible places now.
I like that speculation regarding going underground to survive, but there's also the other view, which is that they built the site, like Gobekli Tepe and some other places, actually after the emergence, after a coming out, as part of a grand ceremonial approach to reconnect the alignment of human beings with the cosmos, and so that if you do the ceremonies correctly, now please leave us alone for a while. Please don't send another comet soon. We're trying to get back in touch with having right alignment with the cosmos. The burying was something that it was not. It was actually fairly common. I mean, you find it among Native Americans. You find it in other parts of the world that you use the site for a while and then you bury it. It's just like breaking the pottery. When you're done with the ceremony. And also with the limestone there, they knew somehow that it wouldn't last that long, so maybe you have to cover it up after 500 years and build another one. Indeed. And then at a certain point, the religion changes, the spiritual tradition changes, and then they abandon the entire project at a certain point.
Indeed.
So, but that's just worth, who knows? I mean, we're just speculating on this.
Right, and the point is, who knows? And I mean, so to be fair, archaeology would tell us that Darien Kuyu, that Cappadocia, came from a much later time. The current theory is that they were built in a sense to go underground and hide from Roman invasion, perhaps. But you cannot date the stone, so the truth is we really don't know. And when sites like Gobekli Tepe come to us and just break the mold of the current models, we have to open our minds and our hearts to new possibilities to find our way back to truth. And Daniel and I will explore moving forward many stories from around the land that talk about coming back after, a great destruction and building sites like Gobekli Tepe, like Daniel said, to realign ourselves to the stars. And maybe even the stars had shifted after these cataclysms, so figuring out how the whole thing works again. But the sites of Darien Kuyu, of Cappadocia, they also bring me home to America and places that we'll talk about in future episodes. But this is a site that I just visited for the first time, Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado at the Four Corners. I see some similarity here. Mesa Verde, not carved out of the native stone as Darien Kuyu, Cappadocia were, but using these cliff overhangs to build cities within them. I had a chance to ask an elder there if there's actually full-on cities inside these great bluffs, and he just smiled, and it felt like that was a maybe. And this is Fajada Butte at Chaco Canyon, just across the border of New Mexico. And I think, this was a just interesting image to me. These are the sacred kivas of the people of the Southwest, the Chacoan culture. Another site, as Daniel mentioned, around the world we see this practice of, in a sense, decommissioning these sacred sites as if they had served their purpose, or maybe they were no longer aligned in ways, or maybe they overdid it. But one thing that's really interesting to me is these geometry of these mysterious kivas, and how just that T shape right there, though it's obviously negative space rather than positive, but it brings me back to this imagery. And Well, Daniel, how do you feel? Is this a wrap? I'm sweating through my favorite Mayan shirt over here.
Yeah, I think this is a good start. And we can just say the next show is going to be going further into the mysteries. It's going to be having to do with my trip to Gunung Padang in Java and to the exploration of things like what was Sundaland, where was Atlantis originally, some other things you don't even know that I want to explore regarding ancient history and some of the ways in which paradigms have shifted and which it might be useful for us to know about in our further adventures into shamanic astrology.
And those adventures continue for you tomorrow, getting on a plane to go out to Avebury and these stone circles in the countryside of the UK. And certainly we'll be speaking about Calendish, this site that is so special to you sometime in the future.
Yeah. And we'll have a show about what we discover here over the next couple of weeks, because just in the last month they keep finding new stuff, more stuff, like a henge bigger than underground near Stonehenge, a 10,000-year-old road nearby. I mean, the story keeps going further and further back. So anyway, look forward to our show next.
All
okay.
Right.
Thanks there, Gemini Brett. We'll talk down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you everyone for joining us. May we always be open to finding new stuff as we further these explorations into the mysteries of shamanic astrology together. For Daniel Giamario, this is Gemini Brett signing off. We will see you in space.
Space. All right.